He says, the idea that some lives matter less than others are the root of all that's wrong in the world. Let me read that one more time. The idea that some lives matter less than others is the root of all that's wrong in the world.
This is the L3 Leadership Podcast, episode number 171. What's up, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the L3 Leadership Podcast. My name is Doug Smith, and I'm the founder of L3 Leadership. We are a leadership development company devoted to helping you become the best leader that you can be. In this episode, you're going to get to hear a talk that was given by my friend and mentor, Brad Henderson, at a recent L3 Leadership breakfast. In the talk, Brad talks about lessons that he's learned from completing 12 Ironman races, and he's about to do his 13th. And so he's obviously a phenomenal athlete, but he's also a phenomenal leader. He's the president of the Pittsburgh Kids Foundation. It's an organization that invests in the lives of local youth leaders, and as a result, they impact thousands of kids locally every single year. They also run summer camps and fall retreats. They do a ton of work in Haiti, and Brad is also the chaplain of the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Pittsburgh Penguins. So just a phenomenal leader. I've been friends with Brad for such a long time, and he's been a huge mentor in my life. And I'm just so appreciative of him, and I know you're going to love this talk. But before we jump into the talk, just a few announcements. I want to let you guys know that we recently introduced L3 Leadership membership. That's right, you can now become a member of L3 Leadership. You might say to me, well, Doug, why become a member? Because I believe every leader needs a group of leaders to go through life with that will encourage them, hold them accountable to their goals, and help them reach their potential. At L3 Leadership, we've developed a community of leaders that will help you do just that. As a member, you'll get access to our community of leaders. You'll have the ability to join a mastermind group, which I believe is absolutely critical to your success. You'll get access to extra resources, content, and a member-only forum on our member-only website. Membership's only $25 a month, and you can sign up at l3leadership.org/membership. I want to thank our sponsor, Henny Jewelers. They are a jeweler owned by my friend and mentor, John Henny. My wife, Laura, and I both got our engagement and wedding rings through Henny Jewelers, and they are just an incredible company. Not only do they have great jewelry, but they also invest in people. John gave Laura and I a book to help us prepare for our marriage, and he's been investing in me as a leader, a dad, and a husband now for many years. So if you're in need of a good jeweler, check out hennyjewelers.com. I also want to thank our sponsor, Alex Landon. Alex is a full-time realtor with Keller Williams Realty, whose team is committed to providing clients with highly effective, premier real estate experiences throughout the greater Pittsburgh region. He's a member and a supporter of L3 Leadership, and he would love the opportunity to connect with you. If you'd like to learn more about Alex and ways to connect with him, go to pittsburghpropertyshowcase.com. And with all that being said, enjoy Brad's talk, and I'll be back at the end with a few announcements.
This will be Ironman number 13 for me. This weekend. And I love the video because it kind of introduces what I'm going to talk about. It saves me some time, but I'm not here to brag about that this morning. One of the things that you realize when you go and watch an Ironman is it's just a lot of ordinary people, like you said in the video, that have set some goals and they're trying to get there. There's nothing that makes you a superstar for doing it. My wife thinks I'm a little crazy. I'm a little stupid. She's learned to support me in that. She's gotten to go some pretty exotic places, right? And one of those is Hawaii. And when you think about the whole Ironman thing, that's immediately what most people think about. But the Ironman is actually a distance. But I remember we were talking a little bit about college days. I was an athlete in college, and I came home from break and realized that was over, right? And I was ready to be done with that, but when you're a kid that's grown up and you've gone to practice every day, all year round, I was like, man, what am I going to do with myself, right? And I was 30 pounds heavier at the time, and was looking at myself in the mirror thinking, man, I'm going to be one of those really short, fat guys if I'm not careful. So I went down the basement, I turned on the TV, and this Hawaii Ironman thing was on. I'd never heard of it before. I had grown up fascinated with Hawaii, right? I don't know if you guys have ever seen that old Brady Bunch episode. I lived that, right? And had this thing. I was wanting to be a surfer, and I'm watching this incredible thing. And to this day, the most famous race was the first time it was ever broadcast. There was this woman who they didn't know who she was, right? She led the race out of the water, and she had a huge lead on the bike, and they're just like scrambling to figure out, do the research. There's no internet in these days or whatever. They find out this gal's like a college swimmer, and she has such a big lead, and the question is she going to be able to hang on, right? So she gets all the way to the end of the run, 26 miles, right? Last mile, she's really struggling to the point where she collapsed, okay? And she's got like over an hour lead on the second place woman who's this really well-known triathlete, right? So the whole last hour of this thing is just showing her, and she would get up and jog a little bit and then collapse, right? And eventually got to the point where she just would crawl a little bit and collapse. Well, she literally got to the point where she was just a few feet from the finish line, and she's crawling towards the finish line, and the woman passed her. I mean, I was just like, this is unbelievable, right? She got second place, right? And she'll always be known as that woman that got second place in the Ironman, right? And it wasn't pretty. But I remember watching that thinking, I'm going to do that thing, right? So I literally, the next day I went out and I bought a bike, and I started doing triathlons, right? And I had no idea how hard it was to get to Hawaii. It was the World Championships. You got to qualify. You got to do all this stuff. So literally, I had 20 years invested, okay? And there's another story behind this story about it. I won't get to that, but in 2006, I found myself treading water in Hawaii, right? Doing the big one. My whole family was there, and actually got to do it twice, and you're in Hawaii, right? When you look down and there's TV cameras under the water and there's divers down there. And, the first day I arrived in Hawaii, there's this really famous highway they do the Ironman. It's called the Queen K. I get off the plane. I can't believe I'm like driving down the Queen K, right? I've been watching this thing for years and years. So I jump into Kona Bay, and I'm doing a training swim, and I'm literally good half mile out in the ocean. Just, it's over a reef and stuff. And I go to swim, and I put my fist forward, and it hits something really solid. And I'm like, did I get such a zone? Did I run into a buoy or something? I looked up, and I'm looking nose to nose with a giant sea turtle. And he's looking at me like, what the heck are you doing here? And I'm looking at him like, what the heck are you doing here, right? But last year at the start of the Ironman, they got this picture of this turtle. I think that's the same turtle, man. He's cruising around Kona Bay. I think he was sending me a message, right? I want you to come back, Brad. So I'm going to try to do that. But one of the really cool things about triathlon is that when you race against the pros, right? So it's a really humbling thing, but it's kind of a fun thing, right? And my daughter she's a teenager when we went, right? And so she's in love with this guy, Norman Stadler. I mean, he's a stud. He's from Germany. He's got this accent. I can make a strong argument this guy's the greatest athlete in the world at the time. You're kind of brash, world-class swimmer, biker, runner, all right? So this is what Norman Stadler looked like when he came across the finish line and won the Ironman that year, and, a couple hours ahead of me, right? I remember I saw them at one loop on the run, got to watch, the head guys going in. But this is quick break here. I'll come back to Norman. Saul. You guys all know who King Saul was, right? Old Testament Saul. Not talking about New Testament Saul that became Paul, but the first king of Israel, right? The Israelites came to God and they said, hey, we want a king. God said, you don't need a king. I'm your king, right? I mean, how stupid was that? They have the king of all kings and they want a human king. But he said, all right? So they do this search for this king. It says there was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish. He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others, right? So basically what he's saying is there was this guy Saul. He was a stud. He says he was a Benjamite. He came from this really well-known community. He came from this really great family, went to a great school, got a great education. But Saul was like a specimen. He looked kingly. He was a head and shoulders out of everybody else. He had that charisma. Everybody said, he's the king. He's the perfect guy to be king, right? But you guys know the story about Saul, right? He had all these really great human gifts to be a great king, but he didn't have a spiritual center. He didn't have that inner drive that he needed to rule the people. Gordon MacDonald, who was a famous pastor back in the day, said natural talent can become both a blessing and a curse. It can lull us into cheating on our spiritual center, right? And this is what Norman Stadler, I got to go to Kona twice, 2 years in a row, right? This is what he looked like when I passed him on the road the second year, right? And, he swim, and, Norman Stadler was kind of a crash and burn kind of personality. set the record on the bike course the year before in Hawaii, and people say, man, he's never going to be able to finish the race at that pace, but he did. The next year he didn't. He went a little too fast. He got halfway through the bike, and I'll never forget riding by Norman on the side of the road thinking, man, slow it down a little bit, Brad. If Norman's laying there, you could be laying there next, right? But when I think about Saul, man, that's Saul. Got out of the gates well, and, one of the most famous stories in all of human history is the story of David and Goliath, right? The backdrop of that story is the crash of Saul. It was the king's job to go out in the battlefield. It was Saul's job to go out in the battlefield and fight against Goliath. He couldn't get himself to go out there, right? Didn't have that inner faith that scrawny little 13-year-old kid did. Saul ended up on the side of the road, and this is a talk about not ending up on the side of the road. Run intentionally. Do you not know that in a race, all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it for a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. Apostle Paul wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. I don't know if you guys have ever, studied much about Rome. Actually, we were going to go to Italy. My wife and I to celebrate our 30th. Kids, son's studying overseas. We postponed that trip to spend some time with him in Australia, which was a good move. But if you were to go to Rome, one of the things you'd be struck by the ruins is just the number of these great stadiums. There was a time when Paul was alive that there were, we have Heinz Field. We're proud of that, PNC Park. Well, think about, there was a dozen of those stadiums at the time that Paul was reading the New Testament just in that general area. You think we're sports crazy, and we are. They were really sports crazy then. So that's the context in which he wrote a lot of the New Testament. And one of the things I think about Paul is he really understands that. If somebody's a runner, it's like, he might actually participated in sports a little bit. But basically what Paul's saying here is, man, you got to have a focus. You got to have a plan. I know that's what you guys are spending here talking about. You don't want to just go through life aimlessly, right? You don't want to just run a race and not know how long it is and, not realize, man, if you go too fast the first 10 miles, you're not going to make it the last 16. But I'm amazed as I look around, most people live their lives that way, especially out of the gates. And finding that balance in our lives is so important, especially from the start, from the get-go. When I was a kid, my dad had a Mustang. My dad loved cars, and I would have to say I still think maybe, and it's probably in the top 5 greatest cars ever made, that Ford Mustang. Yes, 67, right? And my dad was like a 1969 Mustang, right? So I'm dating myself a little bit, but I'm like, 5 years old, and for whatever reason, I got to go with him to pick out the new car. This is like one of my most vivid childhood memories, right? Now, the question is, I should ask him, did I get to go because I had done something good, or did my mom just say, I got 4 kids, you got to get him out of the house tonight? I don't know what it was. But I remember he was haggling with the dealer over price, and I remember crawling around. That thing had black leather seats. Talk about a new car smell. And, one of the great things about being a kid back then is you got to sit in the front seat, right? It's kind of, crazy. Now, no car seats, right? So my dad would drive that car, and it was a manual, the stick shift, and it had 3 dials on the dashboard. I remember seeing it. And what brought this back to me is I rented a Mustang, 5 or 6 years ago. I was on a business trip. Kind of the new knockoff, man. They did a pretty good job. But I got in there, I got behind the wheel, I looked at the dashboard, and it just all came flooding back to me. They did a great job recapturing it. But I remember he would drive, and I would watch the dial and try to predict, when he was going to shift. He'd rev that thing up, and the RPMs would go up. But here's a little homework for you guys, right? Just this simple takeaway from today, if you don't take anything else. Go home sometime this weekend, tomorrow's Sunday. Spend some time just on a piece of paper, draw 3 dials, okay? One for your faith life, right? One for your family life, one for your vocational life. And honestly, just say to yourself, how am I doing in those 3 areas of my life? Am I doing okay? they pretty balanced? Or are there some flashing red lights on the dashboard, right? The whole idea is to avoid that. But the challenge is to keep those things in balance and keep them in focus in our lives. And what you want to kind of go away from is going 3 or 4 years without paying any attention to those dials and those flashing red lights, where you need to stop, pull over, and really do an assessment in your life. But keep an eye on your gauges. I don't know if you guys have a regular time built in your routine where you're kind of evaluating your life, but if you don't, you really should. Right? I mean, even if you have a plan for life, have you guys ever done a personal mission statement? Everybody ever done that? Good for you guys. If you haven't done that, it's a good idea to do that. But I've got one. It's another talk. Just a real simple thing. But I pull that thing out at least once a month and put it in front of me. I mean, it's just a real basic thing, but just to keep my focus, just to make sure, I'm keeping those dials in balance. And one of the challenges I work with these athletes who have this life where they have this really intense 8-9 months of their life, and they try to live their life compartmentalized, where they just do everything in the off season. They don't pay enough attention to their wives during the season. It's during the off season, their kids, their spiritual life, and these flashing red lights come. Most of us are in a situation where we've got no excuse, to not keep things a little more balanced. Be disciplined in your spiritual life. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. Right? Again, this is Paul, right, in Timothy. Little time out here. Physical exercise is a really good thing. Really important thing. I just read this book. A buddy of mine gave me this book. It's called Younger Next Year. He's like, you got to read this, Brad. It'll change your life. Great book. And basically it says to somebody who's 50-year-old, you need to make exercise your job. You need to exercise 6 days a week like it's your job. And I really agree with that. But I would say to you guys, when you're 25, you need to make exercise your job, right? All of us need that physical release that comes from exercise. You will be, it's crazy, but if you exercise an hour a day, you'll have a lot more energy for everything else. You'll have a lot more balance in your life. So if you're not doing that, man, I really, really challenge you guys, okay? This isn't a talk about that. I want to talk about something even more important today, and, that's our spiritual lives, okay? And I have to remind myself of this because there's been a tendency. I started playing golf, all right? I'm thinking, it's a pretty simple game. I want to be a scratch golfer, right? Haven't you guys ever spent any time playing golf? Talk about a black hole, man. I mean, I got down to like a 7 handicap. That's pretty good. But I realized, I'm like spending all this time hitting this like stupid white ball around with a club. And there's a little physical value, I was walked, didn't take card, but not much, right? So I had to make a choice. And I love golf. It's a great social thing, and I might start playing golf again. I thought I'd start playing with my boys. They weren't interested in golf, so the golf clubs went in the closet. But all that to say is I got to remind myself is developing that spiritual dial is much more important. And if I'm going to spend an hour a day, 2 hours a day exercising, I better be spending at least that much time on my spiritual life. And, I've did a D-Min and leadership, wrote a dissertation. I've read all the leadership stuff, John Maxwell. I know Bubba's a big friend. That's all great and good. And there's a ton of stuff out there. It's like overwhelming. It kind of gets recycled, though. It's a lot of the same stuff, refurbished. That's good. But the most important thing I do every morning is get up. For me, it's spending time in God's Word, because that's the roadmap to my life. I'm not saying that has to be it for you. I don't know where you guys are. But to have that time in the morning where you're getting focused for your day, where you're looking at what's in front of you and making sure that you're making the most important things the most important things. It might be that big meeting that's coming up that's 2 weeks away that you need to start thinking about now. It might be, that big date with your wife this weekend that you need to plan. Even more important, right, in the bigger scheme of things. but making sure you got that spiritual focus, that spiritual center going on in your lives. And I'm gonna take a little time out here. I almost, I wanted to be relevant this morning too, and this is another path that God's taken me on, and I didn't want to spend our whole time thinking about this today, but I wanted to put this out here for you guys. Micah, all right, Old Testament. There's a few passages in Scripture that I would say do a really great job of capturing the whole thing. This is one of them. He is an Old Testament prophet. It's kind of buried in there. Might be something you guys have heard before, maybe not. But he says, God has told you what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Okay? Justice. Pretty hot topic in the world we live in today. Right? And I really think as leaders in this day and age, that needs to be something very near and dear to your hearts. That is the issue of the times that we're living in. I've been a little surprised at how it's bubbled up again. And I think some of us worked really hard. I worked really hard on this issue, still working on it. We kind of got to it on a very superficial level, but didn't really, dig into the core of the problems when it comes to human justice. Love and kindness. If you want to know as a Christian, right, somebody who follows Jesus Christ, good question for me is, how's my love life, right? How am I doing at loving other people? Not just my wife and my kids, but the people around me, right? 2 greatest commandments, one of those other things, simple thing, right? What is it? Love God, love your neighbor. That's pretty simple, right? Think of that movie, The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, right? He's going up the mountain. They show his heart. It's like the size of a pea. You getting that analogy? They put a little box around it. I'm talking about the real Grinch, the old Grinch, the Dr. Seuss Grinch, not the Jim Carrey Grinch, and they've reinvented them so many times. But what happens, right? Here's little Cindy Woohoo singing the Christmas songs down there. The hearts start growing. That's a great visual for us. That's really what should be happening in our lives. And, the question I ask myself every morning I get up is my heart for God and other people getting bigger or smaller? It's a pretty simple question, right? One we need to answer. Paul Farmer says this. We were talking about Paul Farmer this morning. Famous doctor, runs an organization, Partners in Health, works for the poor, UN, World Medical Federation, one of the smartest guys that ever lived, right? He says the idea that some lives matter less than others are the root of all that's wrong in the world. Let me read that one more time. The idea that some lives matter less than others is the root of all that's wrong in the world. Wow. That is profound. But that's the world that we live in. Okay? And another quick time out is I think it's important for us to know, the context that we live in too. We live in the United States of America, the wealthiest country in the world. And it's pretty easy growing up in the United States of America thinking every place is this way. I grew up with this invisible backpack on. I didn't even realize it until I was probably 40 years old. And what am I talking about? Well, I am a white American-born citizen of the strongest nation of the world. And everywhere I go, I carry that. It's this thing that puts me up on a podium. I didn't even realize it. Gives me this, special place in the world. And, in our country, as I've gotten to know people of different, races and spent some time with them. Here's a good story that captures this for you really quickly, so I don't spend too much time doing this. My best buddy that I did my doctor of ministry work with, big guy, named Ken Watson, pastors an inner city church. We look like kind of Tweedledee and Tweedledum. We're together. He's big. He's African American. He weighs almost 300 pounds. He played, linebacker at University of Maryland. Played for the Cleveland Browns. Got a great guy. We'd love to hang out together, right? So his son Benjamin, who I've been close to growing up, plays in the NFL, right? Benjamin gets to the Super Bowl, and he says, Brad, I want you to come watch me in the Super Bowl. So being a great friend, I said, sure, I'll come watch you. Unfortunately, he played for the New England Patriots, right? And they actually beat the Steelers in the AFC Championship game that year. But we are literally getting on the bus to go to the game. This is the New England Patriots family bus, okay? Now, Ken has been one of these people that have pointed out this backpack to me that I didn't know I had, that I didn't know where to go. So we always have these bets going on. So he says, we got these passes to get on the bus, right? He's like, Brad, man, I'll bet you dinner at the game, right? It's no small thing, dinner at the Super Bowl, that they won't give you a hard time at all if you don't have your pass. But if I don't have my pass out, they're not going to let me get on this bus. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to take this bet, right? This is the New England Patriots bus. Look around. These are parents of players. I mean, maybe I could be related to the kicker, right? Ken looks like he could still be playing, man. The guy's totally jacked and he's obviously the dad of one of the players. So I'm like, you go first, Ken. I'm going to take this bet. I'm already thinking about what I want to eat, right? So sure enough, we put our passes in our back pockets, and he goes to get on the bus. And the bus driver, it's white, won't let him get on the bus. He's like, I'm Benjamin Watson's dad, and the other people are saying you're his dad. So he's fumbling around, finally finds his pass, right? I got my pass in the back pocket. I'm like right after this. I'm the next guy in line. The guy just looks at me and says, go, get on the bus. I'm like, you got to be kidding me, buddy. You just cost me dinner, right? But that's the world we live in. And that's what we have to embrace. The other thing, Doug didn't tell you, and I understand it. One of the biggest reason he invited me, he hangs out with me, is because I'm one of the richest guys in the world, and he didn't put that in my bio this morning because I don't like to put that out there, but it's true, right? If you put my income and my wife's income together, right? We're empty nesters. We're both working full time. We make just barely six figures, over $100,000, right? You know what? That makes me one of the richest guys in the whole world. It does. Like, if you were to line up people, Philip, through, I'm in the 99.8th percentile. 0.02% of the people in the world make more than me, right? Wow. That's pretty amazing. Michael's thinking, man, I'm going to hang out with this guy, Brad. He's a millionaire, right? Wow. It's true. It's totally true. Go to this website. A friend of mine sent me there, globalrichlist.com. You can punch in there how much you make, and it'll tell you based on a world scale. Talk about an eye-opener for me. Now, Bubba mentioned I spent a lot of time in Haiti. That's been a good perspective with me. I spend time, literally, there was a time when I was probably spending half of my life with the poorest people in the entire world. That's been, some really good perspective for me. But what am I saying about all that? You guys got to embrace that. When Jesus talks in Scripture about the rich man, harder for a camel to go through the eye of needle, the rich man and the kingdom of God, that should get your attention, right? But here's the thing. I think I have a responsibility living in the most powerful country in the world, hanging out. I mean, some of my friends, man, they are really dirty, stinking rich. They're even rich from an American's perspective. That I've got to be challenging them to be redistributing, God's resources. Hey, take a step back. The perspective's there. And why do I tell you that? I think that mindset's really important in terms of what you're doing with the rest of your life. We need to think globally. We got a president that's trying to shrink our world right now, and it just doesn't work. Hey, man, I was a part of the good old days back in 1976, right, where we went to the Memorial Day parade and we did all that stuff. Those days are over. Those were, they're not as bad as some people are making them out to be, but they're long gone. And as leaders, next generation of leaders, man, you got to have a global mindset, and you got to realize where we fit in this global thing and how many people are really struggling out there just to survive. I'm going the wrong way here. Life is full of quitting points. First time I did the Ironman, I was in the swim, And, you jump in there with 2,000 people, adrenaline's flowing, and, it takes about an hour to do that swim. And I'm like 15 minutes into it, and we swam through a bunch of jellyfish. And the guy next to me got stung in the side of the face and couldn't breathe. And, they have lifeguards out there. That he was fine. They pulled him out of the water. But he was done. He was done. And I got stung in my shoulder. And I'm swimming thinking, man, I can't believe this. I worked 20 years to get here, and I could be done. There's no second chance. They're not going to say, oh, sorry, Brad, you got stung by a jellyfish. You can come back next year. Luckily I was able to swim through that, right? Next year I'm in Hawaii, and I'm feeling pretty good about how I did the year before, so I'm thinking, I'm going to go fast this year. I'm going to have the best race of my life. Not a good mindset to start an Ironman with. So literally, swim goes really well. I get to the bike course is straight kind of up this mountain, right? So the first half is really tough. Wind's in your face. Second half, you make the turnaround and you come back, you got the wind at your back, and it's not, like really downhill, but downhill and pretty flat, much easier, right? So I get to the turnaround. I'm an hour ahead of my time from the year before. I'm thinking, this is going to be the greatest race of my life, right? But what happened was the wind shifted. And I thought I was going to have the wind at my back. I'd worked really hard into the wind. And not only did I have 56 miles in the wind, I got 56 more in the wind. If you guys have ever ridden your bike, you know what I'm talking about. Like as a little kid, if the wind's blowing and stuff. Totally deflating. I got to the transition area, and I was 1 minute slower than I'd been the year before when I was putting my running shoes on. But the year before, I was exhilarated. I didn't know if I was going to make it to the finish line, man. I did not know. I'm thinking, here I am in Hawaii, got all these people following me online, and I might DNF, right? Did not finish. But was able to eat some stuff, kind of fight through it, and actually ended up doing okay. Finished a couple minutes behind time for the year before. But, life is like that. Every day, I don't know where you guys are in your business. Some of you guys might be doing really great right now. Some of you guys might be doing really great in your relationships. But there will come a time when you're going to struggle. You're going to hit a wall in your life, in whatever you're doing. My wife and I have been married 30 years. I think we have a great marriage. But we have a great marriage because we've fought through a lot of quitting points along the way. We do a lot. I do weddings. It's one of the great things about being an ordained pastor. But, one of the real heart-wrenching things is, having those coffees with people that are 10 years into it that are calling it quits. And, I think that, we have quitting points every day in our life, whether it's getting out of bed to exercise, getting out of bed on Monday morning to kind of get our focus for the week, whatever it is. But you got to learn to fight through those quitting points in your life. Even if they're little quitting points, it's pretty easy for people to become quitters. Across the board. And life's really about the decisions you're making day in and day out. Leadership's really about the decisions you're making day in and day out. To keep those, priorities straight, to hang in a relationship, to stay focused on that goal, in your vocational life, even though everybody's saying, man, this is really stupid. The people that are working around you, but to fight and to keep fighting through. We're getting close to the end here. I keep going the wrong way. I'm going to finish with this. There's a passage of scripture that I've told my wife, I've told my kids, I've told those around me, someday I'd like to have this on my tombstone. That sounds like a morbid thought, but guess what? We all have a 100% chance of dying someday. And I have to change this. I'm not going to have a tombstone, right? My wife and I are in Sydney, Australia, right? Probably the most beautiful city in the world. And we're walking along this coastal walk, one of the most beautiful places I've ever been, and there's this huge cemetery. Somebody thought, man, this is like the perfect place for a cemetery, right? There's nothing around here. It's probably started, 1,000 years ago, and here it is, right? Really? Cemetery? Gravestones? I remind my wife, I want to be cremated. I don't want to take up any space, right? But somewhere, whether it's on the fireplace or whatever, they got a little thing. I want this right at my funeral. I fought the good fight. I finished the race, right? And, life's a fight, man. I mean, like I said, you got to be willing to fight through quitting. But you guys are learning that, right? I'm 53, and I'd have to say, yeah, life's a fight, daily challenge. I finished the race. I've kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. I only want this red if it fits. At the end of the day, I really want my kids to be able to say, my dad, he wasn't perfect. But you know what? He was a fighter. God gave him a focus and a purpose in his life. And he not only ran the race, but he finished well. He didn't crawl to the finish line. He finished strong. And that's my hope and prayer for you guys. In your vocational lives, I know that's important. But more importantly, in your personal lives, in your spiritual lives, that as I look around this room, someday, we'd all be in the kingdom together and we'd be able to say, Crystal, how did it go? And she could say, you know what? There's a lot of things I'd do differently, but I finished strong. I finished well. Max, Doug, whoever it is. And to finish well, you got to start well. And you got to run the race with intentional focus and purpose every step of the way. You got to be willing to, fight for those vocational goals. You got to be willing to fight for your marriage. And some of you guys are parents, to have that focus with your kids. It's a great thing to release them to and be an empty nester. I could have given you a great empty nester talk, but you guys aren't there today. And also, to embrace this place that God's, put you in your life. When I first realized I had this backpack on, I went through this thing where I had this terrible sense of guilt about it. But then I realized, hey, you know what? God chose my parents. God chose my race. Everything about me came from Him. I need to be grateful for that, not feel guilty of that. But I need to embrace that responsibility, right? In the book of Matthew, it says, to much, those of whom much has been given, much is expected. I'm one of those guys, man, someday when I'm face to face with Him. But most importantly, I want Him to say, Brad, good job, man. It was a little dicey there a few times. I thought you were going to quit, but you finished, and you have that ultimate prize.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to Brad's talk. I really hope it added value to your life. You can find ways to connect with him and everything he's doing with the Pittsburgh Kids Foundation in the show notes at l3leadership.org/episode 171. As always, thank you so much for being a listener, and it would mean the world to me if you would subscribe and leave a rating and review for this podcast. It really does help us grow our audience, so thank you in advance for that. I want to thank our sponsors, BAB Inc., led by my friend Russell Livingston. BAB is an insurance broker, third-party administrator, and consulting firm here in Pittsburgh. If your company has any insurance needs, I can't encourage you enough to check them out. They're incredible, and they have a huge passion for developing next-generation leaders. You can learn more at babbins.com. That's BABBINS.com. And lastly, if you want to stay up to date with everything we're doing here at L3 Leadership, you can simply sign up for our email list at l3leadership.org, and you'll start getting weekly emails with everything that we're doing. And as always, I like to end with a quote, and I'm going to use one that Brad used because I thought it was that good, by Dr. Paul Farmer. He said this, he said, "The idea that some lives matter less than others is the root of all that's wrong in the world." The idea that some lives matter less than others is the root of all that's wrong in the world. That is so good. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of L3 Leadership. Laura and I appreciate you so much, and we'll be back next episode.